Hi, Janet.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Thank you. Long time no see.
Yes, it's nice to see your face. I'm sorry we can't do it in person, but hopefully that day is coming soon.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, how are you holding up?
All right. Fair. I
Yeah,
lost my son. I think you knew that.
Todd did share that with me. I'm so sorry to hear that, Janet. That's just
Yeah,
a nightmare.
in July. So that's been a very tough year for me.
Absolutely. I'm so
Uh,
sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah. He has children as well?
3 children. Yeah.
How old are they?
They're grown, 34, 27, and 23, 24.
Yeah.
But they're grown, but really tough.
Oh, oh horrible.
Mhm.
Horrible. Janet, I'm actually gonna pull you and I are gonna go over into a breakout room here for a minute, so hang tight.
Okay.
Okay. And Janet, do you see an invitation to join a breakout room? There you go. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to be getting started here in just a couple moments. We're going to wait for a few more teachers to log in. So to all of my colleagues out there, as we're getting set up, I've just sent out an email to all of our students and I've copied all of the staff on this. And that has a link to YouTube Live. So if you have remote students at home, if you could please direct them to use the YouTube Live link so that they can log in and watch this from home. And I would ask that if you have not already done so, if you could toggle your view to speaker view, not gallery view. And the way that you use speaker view, the way that you access speaker view is go in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. You'll see a grid with the word view next to it. And then you'll have the option to go speaker or gallery. And please make sure that you are toggled to speaker view. I am going to be sharing a slide presentation once we get started here. And once that goes up, you're able to adjust the pane back and forth. And ask these sort of split your screen. So half the screen will feature Janet speaking and about half the screen will be the slideshow. And if you have any questions on how to do that, just ask your students. I'm sure they'll be able to help you. I would also ask for all of my colleagues that you please, if you would both mute your microphone and mute your video as well, please. So again, for all of my colleagues, if you could please both mute your microphone and mute your video as well. All right, so we're going to get started here in just another moment or so.
Okay.
And for my colleagues, again, you can have it on speaker view. You can also, once you see Janet Applefield Square open up, you can also pin that view as well, and that will make sure that Janet is captured up on your screen.
Also, remember to mention that this program is sponsored by the Milford Cultural Council.
Yes, absolutely. Once we start recording, I'll make that announcement. You bet. Okay. All right, so I can see that we're starting to have students logging into the YouTube live stream. So, and I think we've got probably all of our classrooms are now with 76. So we're gonna get started. So I'm gonna start the recording. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank all of my colleagues and all of our students for coming together this afternoon and stopping our normal programming for this very special event. I am so pleased to welcome Janet Applefield to the Milford High School community, and I'm so glad that we can gather together as an entire community to listen and learn from Janet this afternoon. Janet first visited Milford High School 2 years ago in the spring of 2019, and a small number of our students were present and had the opportunity to listen and learn from Janet then, and we had hoped to have Janet return last spring, but unfortunately the pandemic cut that short, and we've been working together throughout this year to find a date and time where it would work to have Janet address all of our students, and I'm thankful that we're able to make it happen today. I'm not necessarily going to spend any more time introducing Janet other than to say that I want to thank the Milford Cultural Council for their generous support, and they made it possible for us to have Janet here this afternoon. And Janet, on behalf of the Milford High School community, I want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for taking time to speak with us here this afternoon. And Janet, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I speak to thousands of students every year with the hope that it will promote greater awareness and understanding of the dangers of hatred, of any type of discrimination. And it's my hope that each and every one of us will stand up to any type of intolerance. I speak about the Holocaust because it was one of the most vicious and heinous crimes in the history of mankind. As a result of World War II, between 50 million and 60 million people were killed. 6 million Jewish people were murdered because the Nazis had a particular hatred against Jews, and they were determined to destroy all Jews of Europe. Of course, they didn't just discriminate against Jews, they discriminated against Polish people, Russian people, communists, intellectuals, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses. 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered. Only 11% survived, and I was one of those very lucky children. I was born in Krakow, Poland, and I lived with my mother, father, baby sister in a little town outside of the city of Krakow called Nowy Targ, which means New Market. I lived there with a large extended family, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles. I was the first grandchild in the family, so needless to say, I was very pampered and spoiled. I have a lot of wonderful memories of those first few years of my life. I had an uncle who had a motorcycle with a little sidecar. He would put me in there, take me for rides, take me to the candy store. I remember cooking and baking with my mother and my grandmother, preparing for holidays. By the way, my birth name was not Janet, it was Gustava. And throughout my childhood, my name was changed several times. Also, my appearance had a lot to do with my survival because I looked like a typical Aryan child. Aryan or Aryanism was a doctrine that was developed by the Nazis. They thought that people should have certain appearance. They thought that people should be light, light hair, light skin, and a certain features. They were trying to develop a master race that would rule all of Europe. So as I mentioned, I had really wonderful memories of those first 4 years of my life. But everything changed very abruptly. September 1st, 1939 was the beginning of World War II. I was just 4 years old. My father told me that he was awakened by hearing explosions. He turned on the radio. Of course, in those days, there was no television. He turned on the radio and he heard the announcer say that that Poland was attacked. So the first few days of the war were very chaotic and confusing. My father sent me and my mother and my baby sister to my other grandparents' home in another little town. And when we arrived there, everybody was packing up their belongings and running away, heading eastward. My grandfather packed up our wagon, and we too started on this long journey, heading eastward. People were walking or on bicycles, or some had cars, but not too many, mostly in wagons. I remember seeing an airplane that crashed, it burned, and it exploded. I also remember having to jump off the wagon because there were planes overhead shooting at us. Sometimes roads and bridges would be out and we had to cross the river by foot. And after several very difficult days, we arrived at our destination. Now, my father and my uncles tried to join the Polish army, but Poland was defeated in 1 month's time. And when that happened, they joined this caravan of people that was constantly streaming out of Poland into Russia. When he arrived, he had no idea where we were. Communication in those days was difficult because not many people had telephones, and certainly there were no cell phones yet. My father advertised in the newspaper looking for us, and in time he was able to find us. Two very tragic things happened. There was shortage of work, and there was shortage of food, and conditions was very, very harsh. But there was an announcement made that any men who needed a job should report at the town hall. My two uncles decided to go to find a job. And my father was not feeling well that day, so he didn't go. When my uncles arrived there was a marching band playing, and they were made to sing nationalistic songs. And then they were marched to a nearby ravine, told to take their clothes off, and they were shot into the ravine. That night, we waited for them to come home, and they never came home that night or the next day or ever. Another very tragic thing happened. My baby sister got very sick. She contracted diphtheria. Diphtheria is a disease that we no longer get in this country because when you were babies, you were vaccinated against this terrible disease. But in those days, there was no vaccine and there was no treatment, and my baby sister died. She was just 18 months old. After we were in Russia for several months, there was an order made that all these people that came from Poland, in order to be allowed to stay and work, had to take out Russian citizenship. Well, the family was divided. They didn't know what to do. But my parents were afraid to stay because they thought once the war would be over, they couldn't go back to get their property back. So we returned back to Poland. Now, my grandparents and one aunt and uncle stayed, and the people that stayed were put onto trains and sent off to Siberia. Siberia is a region of Russia that's extremely cold and very, very terrible weather. And then they were sent to labor camps for slave labor. My grandmother died there. When we arrived back in our town, all the Jewish people were forced to live in a ghetto. A ghetto was a neighborhood that the Nazis selected. They made all the Jewish people move into that neighborhood. Now, the ghettos in the big cities had high walls with cement walls with barbed wire on top, and they were guarded. But this ghetto was open. There were no walls around it. I remember one time the Gestapo, the secret police, came to our apartment. They were searching for valuables. They made everybody undress. They were searching for jewelry, money, furs, art, and they just took whatever they wanted. All the Jewish people were forced to wear armbands with the Star of David to identify themselves as Jews. Every day there were roundups of people. Some were taken to the local cemetery, made to dig their own graves and shot into the graves, and some were sent off to labor camps. When we first arrived, my father was arrested because they said he was a communist because we came from Russia. And I remember cooking with my mother and bringing my father his meals. In time, he was released. When all these roundups were happening, my father heard that the Gestapo was looking for him. So my parents decided that we would try to escape. So one night, we left the ghetto and we went to the train station. Train stations were very dangerous because that's where the plainclothes Gestapo would often be. But we managed to take a train and we ended up in another town where my mother had relatives living. When we arrived there, it was a very similar situation because the Nazis were very well organized. My parents then decided that we would try to escape once again. One night, it was a very bright night, the moon was out, it was August 1942. My father got a horse and wagon, And we started to drive out of town, but we did not get very far when suddenly in the distance, we saw police coming. We started to run, and you might wonder, why would we run? What would we run from the Polish police? And the reason for that was that Poland was very anti-Semitic country. They were very prejudiced against Jewish people. And the Polish police cooperated and collaborated with the Nazis. So we were scared and we were running, and we came to these fields where potato plants were growing. We tried to hide, but potato plants are short. So very soon they came and they found us and they beat us up and made us return. And at that point, my parents realized that there was nowhere to run, nowhere to escape, no place to hide. They were desperately trying to find someone who would be willing to take me and hide me. They were able to convince a woman, her name was Maria. She was a nanny to one of my cousins. They begged Maria to take me, and she agreed. So one day my parents sat me down and explained I was going to go with Maria, that I should be good and I should listen, and that we would be reunited soon. So I left with her. In the meantime, there was another order that stated that the people from that town and all the surrounding towns had 3 days to report at an area outside of Krakow called Wieliczka. My parents made another decision. They decided they would separate from each other. Their thinking was that once they separated, they had a better chance of one of them surviving. So they went to this place independently. And when they arrived there were approximately 12,000 people congregated in a big meadow. It was very hot. There was no place to sleep, and there was no food or water, so they had to sleep outside. And then there was a selection. A selection meant that there were SS officers who made a decision who would live and who would die. Approximately 1,000 men were selected for slave labor. My father was one of those men. The rest of the people were put into 53 boxcars. Between 120 and 150 people were put into 53 boxcars marked with the letter B. B for the name Belzec, a concentration camp called Belzec. It was so crowded in these cars that they couldn't sit or lie down. They had to stand for 5 days. The floor of each boxcar was sprinkled with a white disinfectant. And when that got wet, it gave off toxic fumes. So they were sent to Belzec. Now I will be telling you about concentration camps, and I'd like you to understand that camps in this context mean a lot different than what we know camps to be. When we think of camps, we think of summer, recreation, fun, sports, all the wonderful things. But these camps were designed to work people to death, to starve them, and to eventually kill them. So my grandmother, many of my family members were sent to this camp. So when these 53 boxcars arrived, the people were taken off the train. Some were already dead. The rest were taken to the crematorium, to the gas chamber, and they were killed. It took only 3 hours from the time they left the train to when they were killed. This camp existed only 6 months, and in that period of time, 600,000 people were murdered. Only 2 people survived this camp. When the Nazis learned how to kill more efficiently, they started to send people to Auschwitz. Now, this camp was burned to the ground, And today there's a monument and a museum standing there. So I left with Maria. Maria had an apartment in the city. I remember so well being in that apartment because there were times when she would leave me alone in the evening and go out, lock the door, and leave me alone. I was really scared because I was in a pitch black apartment. I was crying. I was trying to unlock the door. Obviously, I couldn't. One time there was a loud noise, loud knock on the door. Maria opened the door. There was an SS officer standing there. And he said, I have orders to search your apartment to see if you're hiding any Jews. He barged in. He looked under all the furniture. He turned some of the furniture over. And he came to me. He held out my braid. And he asked Maria who I was. She explained that I was her niece. She was taking care of me because her sister was sick. He looked at me with his chilling blue eyes, and he turned around and he left. And to this day, I remember what he looked like. He had blonde hair, blue eyes. He was wearing black leather boots up to his knees, and I could hear the clicking of his heels as he went down the steps. Now, my father was sent to the Krakow ghetto. Every morning at 5 a.m, he and other prisoners were marched to a local cable factory. My father worked on an assembly line making electrical cables. He told me he kept a little photograph of me in front of him. He said the only reason he wanted to survive was knowing that he gave me away and he had to find me when the war would be over. He told me he was starving because all they were given to eat was a little piece of bread and black coffee in the morning and at night. He also told me he had a German foreman who every once in a while would give my father a little extra piece of bread. And of course, my father was so very grateful for that. While my father was still living in the ghetto, the Nazis were building the concentration camp called Płaszów. It's on the outskirts of the city of Krakow. When that camp was completed, the Krakow ghetto was liquidated and all the people were sent to live in the concentration camp. Now, my father knew that he had to make different arrangements for me because Maria was risking her own life. It was very dangerous what she was doing, and she said she couldn't continue to do it. He was able to contact a cousin who was living on falsified Polish papers, which meant that she had Polish identity. So one day, my care was transferred from Maria to my cousin. My cousin was able to obtain a birth certificate from a Catholic priest of a little Polish Catholic girl whose name was Krystyna Antoszkiewicz. And I took on this little girl's identity. I became her. So my new name was Krystyna, and my nickname was Krysha. My cousin was young, very young. She was just 19. She was very confident, very brazen. There would be times when we would take the trolley car in the city, and she would always tell me to be quiet, not to say a word, because Polish people were not permitted to sit in front of the trolley. And she spoke German fluently, and I didn't. That's why she would tell me to be quiet, and we would take the trolley and sit in the front. And she was able to, get away with it. We lived in another town outside of the city of Krakow. She was very mean to me, very cruel. She used to beat me with a fireplace poker. And when I cried out for my mother, she would say, your mother is dead. She's never coming for you. One time she threw me into a river, told me to swim when I couldn't. I almost drowned. Sometimes she would go out for the whole day, leave me outside, lock the door. I'd have to sit on the front stoop in my pajamas, cold and hungry. There was a nice lady. Her name was Janina. I remember when I injured my fingers so badly from the beating, and all my fingernails turned black and blue, and my nails got infected and they started to fall off. Janina made bandages for all my fingers. And sometimes when I'd be sitting on the front stoop, hungry, she would give me a piece of bread to eat, and sometimes she would let me play with her baby. And I also had to take these very heavy packages to the post office. They were so big and heavy, I could barely carry them. And I didn't know what it was in those packages till much later when I found out. Now, my cousin had a boyfriend, a Polish boyfriend that used to visit her. And he had a shoe factory, but behind the shoe factory, they were making ammunition. And she was in the Polish resistance. So in those boxes that I carried to the post office were shoes and boots, but in the shoes and boots were hand grenades, guns, bullets, all kinds of arms. And these were being mailed to different resistance groups throughout Poland. One day, she came to me and said that she had wonderful news to tell me. Well, it wasn't so wonderful, but she said that she was taking me to the city. And so when we arrived in the city, she took me into a church and she told me to sit and wait for her while she was going into a cafe. So I sat and I waited for her and waited, and she never came back. So finally, after hours of sitting in the church, I walked out. And it was late afternoon, and I saw that the street was cordoned off. And I crossed the street, and there were little groups of people standing and talking. And I overheard them say that the Gestapo had come and they arrested everybody in that cafe. So here I was, 7 years old, walking up and down the street crying. I just didn't know what to do. Suddenly, a woman came up to me and very quickly put me under her coat, her cape. And she said, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" I explained that my cousin was in that cafe and she was arrested. I said, "Could you please take me to the bus? I was going to go back to my village." And she said, "Oh, no, you're too little." So she took me into the building, the same building where the cafe was, to the apartment of a woman by the name of Alicia Goom. Alicia asked me, "What happened? Who are you? Where are you from?" And I had a story that I practiced to tell if I was ever captured. And so the story that I told was that I was the daughter of a Polish officer, and I came from Warsaw, and both of my parents were killed in a bombing raid, and I was living with my cousin, and now she was gone. Alicia said I could stay. However, I couldn't stay in that apartment for 3 reasons. One was that there was an SS officer living in the building. Another reason was that Alicia's mother belonged to the resistance, and in her apartment, she ran a hospital, she had shortwave radios, and she had ammunition. And the third reason was that when the Gestapo made an arrest, they always came back the second time. So that early evening, the oldest son, Staszek, took me and we walked for several miles, and we came to a farm that was owned and operated by the Catholic Church. And Alicia's brother-in-law was the administrator of the farm, so I remained on the farm. I remember one time we had slaughtered a pig. Now, Polish people were forbidden to kill animals for their own consumption. That was strictly reserved for Germans, but they had just slaughtered the pig and they were cutting up the carcass in the kitchen. And suddenly there was a knock on the door. Someone came to tell us that the police was coming. So very quickly, they cleaned everything up. They hid everything in the attic. And finally they came. And when they came, I was scared because I was always afraid of uniforms. As I mentioned to you earlier, Polish police collaborated and cooperated with the Nazis. So everybody was afraid of them. So I don't know what made me do this, but I said, give them vodka. So they started to drink. And then I started to sing and dance. And they were drinking and laughing at me and amused. And finally they left. And my father told me of an incident that happened to him. One night in the middle of the night, he had to use the bathroom outside, and he found a cigarette stub and he was smoking. A guard saw him and shot him in the face. The bullet lodged under my father's cheekbone and just stopped. Of course, he couldn't get any medical treatment, so that bullet had to remain in his face. When the Nazis realized that they were losing the war, they wanted to destroy any evidence. So my father's job and all the prisoners' job was to dig up the thousands of bodies that were buried all around this camp. So they had to dig up the bodies, put them in a big mountain, and burn these bodies. My father said he couldn't get the smell of the burning flesh and bones for a very long time. When that job was completed, the Nazis burned this camp to the ground. Today there's a monument there. And the remaining prisoners were sent to different concentration camps. My father ended up with going to 3 different concentration camps. Now, when the war was coming to an end, they were fighting all around the farm. So it was pretty dangerous. We too had to go outside to go to the bathroom. So it was dangerous. So we left the farm and we moved back to Krakow. And I remember when there were bombings and air raids, because we would wake up in the middle of the night with sirens sounding. We had to put on our coats and light a candle and walk down the steps to the cellar. Now, this was a dugout cellar, dirt floor, and all around the cellar there were wooden benches. So everybody was sitting on the benches and holding a candle. And we sat there until we heard another siren that told us that we were free to go upstairs, that everything was, the bombing was over. So, so when the war ended, my cousin's father found me. He came to get me. Now, I didn't want to go with him because I was afraid of him, just the way I was afraid of his daughter. But of course, the family didn't feel they should keep me because he was my relative. So they let me go. And I left with him, but he didn't keep me long. He turned me over to a refugee center in Krakow. I was in this big room with about 70 children. I was 10 years old when the war ended. And every day they posted lists of names of survivors. Along came a woman, her name was Lena. Lena came every day looking at the list, searching for her family. And she came across this room full of children and made a decision that she should do something for the children. So in time, she was able to open 2 orphanages. I remember the night we left for the orphanage. We had to leave in the middle of the night because there were men picketing in front of the refugee center, carrying hateful slogans. And there were notes posted on the door saying we would be murdered. Anti-Semitism after the war was even more severe than before the war. So we climbed into the trucks. They pulled tarpaulin covers over us so we wouldn't be seen. One of the trucks was for children who had tuberculosis and other infectious diseases because the Polish hospitals refused to take Jewish children. So I went to live in an orphanage. Only the older children, high school age children, were sent to school. But every day they came back, they were beaten up by the Polish kids. Lena went to the school pleading with the principal and the teachers to protect the children, but they didn't. And Lena was always afraid that our home would be attacked because the other orphanage was attacked 3 times. And finally, it was decided that it was too dangerous. So they closed that orphanage and those children came to live with us. And because Lena was so afraid that our home would be attacked, she obtained ammunition. And all the older children were trained in use of ammunition. And one night, a Polish lady knocked on the door. She came to tell us that our home was going to be attacked. So the children took their positions on the terrace and the balcony, and they waited. And in the middle of the night, Polish men came. They were on horseback, they were carrying fire torches, and they were shooting. But the children were able to defend the home. One day, Lena went back to Krakow to pick up some provisions, and she overheard a man asking about his child. She said, "Can you describe what your daughter looks like?" And when he did, she said, "I think I have your daughter." She came back to the orphanage and called me to her office and said, "I have wonderful news to tell you. Your father has survived." And I will always remember the reunion with my dad because he was hugging me and kissing me and telling me he's going to take me away. I didn't want to go because I was scared of him. He looked like a skeleton. You know, his clothes hung on him. And I didn't want to go because for the first time I had friends. Lena was our mother. We called her mother. And but my father was sick. He really couldn't take me right away. So he rented a room nearby. I visited him every day, or he would come to me, and we got reacquainted. He gained weight. He got healthier, and in time he was able to take me. We went back to our village, and we lived with like 4 or 5 of my father's friends who survived above my grandparents' store. But we weren't safe there. There were notes posted on our front door saying we would be murdered. 2 of my father's friends were murdered. 2 young men driving in a car. They were ambushed and shot. My father went to the police chief asking for protection. And the police chief said all he could do is to give my father a gun. So my father slept with a gun. And after a while, he decided it was too dangerous to stay. So we left our town and we moved back to Krakow. By that time, my grandfather and my aunt and uncle returned from Siberia, and we lived with them. And my father made a decision that we had to leave Poland because Poland didn't offer us anything anymore. It was dangerous. We couldn't get our property back. We never got it back. We weren't wanted. And Poland was one big morgue. So he had 2 brothers, one living in Palestine and one in the United States. And he came to me and asked me where I wanted to go. And I said, "I want to go to America." I said that because I heard that money grew on trees. Well, I don't know where I heard that, but I believed it. So it took about 2 years for us to get proper documents. We had distant relatives in New Jersey who sent us documents that basically stated that if my father couldn't support himself and support me, that the family would take care of us so that we would never become a burden to this country and have to go on public assistance. So in March 1947, my father and I sailed to America on a marine transport boat. It was very rough crossing because the Atlantic is stormy in March. Everybody was very seasick. I remember really enjoying the vending machines, something I had never seen before, putting in a nickel and getting a really big Milky Way. And in those days, Milky Ways were, really good size. And the other food that I loved was red Jello. I had never seen food like that before. So we arrived in New York Harbor. We were met by my uncle and his new wife, and we settled in New Jersey. I had never been to school. I was almost 12 when I came here. And my uncle took me to an elementary school. And right there in the school office, he said to me, "What name do you want? You have to have an American name." So I thought for a minute, and I came up with the name Jeanette, because we had a cousin who was French. She lived in Paris, and she used to visit us in Poland in the summer. And she had long, beautiful red nails, and she was very glamorous. And her name was Jeanette. So I said Jeanette, and my uncle said, "No, in English it's Janet." So that's what I was registered as, and that was my new name. And I was put in a fifth, sixth grade combination grade. But by the end of school year in June, I was promoted to seventh grade, which was the correct grade for me. And then, but we had another really serious problem. We came on a 90-day visitor's visa. In 90 days, we had another visa to go to Venezuela. The only way we could remain in this country is if my father married an American citizen. So the family looked around and they found them a wife. So in that short period of time, I had a new stepmother, I had a new name, I had a new appearance because they cut my hair. I had new language, new friends. Everything was new. Everything was exciting and new. I remember my eighth grade teacher always referred to me as that little foreign girl. I was trying to fit in and blend in and not stand out, but that's how she identified me. But I was very fortunate because I had a wonderful group of girlfriends who kind of took me under their wing, socialized me. And of course, then I continued. I went to high school. I was a good student, except for one subject, geometry. I never could get geometry. But otherwise, most of the time I was on the honor roll, and I was active in different clubs and student council and different school band and French club and different things like that. And I graduated and off to college I went. But at age 19, I got married. So you have to understand that in those days, girls or young women married young, very young. My friends were getting married, so I got married. I promised my parents I would finish college. I kept my promise, but it was very hard. I carried a baby to class and to my exams, but I did it. I got my bachelor's degree. And later on, I continued my education. I got my master's degree at Boston University in social work. So today, I have 3 children, although I lost my son last summer. I have 5 grandchildren. And I know that when I'm no longer here, my legacy will continue because they will tell my story. And I have a very special favor to ask of all of you. How many of you think you could tell my story to someone who has never heard it? I hope some of you have raised your hand. It's a special gift to me because I think it's an important story. And I've often thought about the people who saved my life because they did something they didn't have to do. They did something that was very dangerous, and yet they, they just were willing to do that. And they didn't just save my life; they saved the lives of future generations, of millions, thousands of people. So I'm forever grateful for that. And I've often also thought about the decisions and choices that people make, because even the smallest acts of kindness have a ripple effect. So I urge all of you to be mindful of the kinds of choices and decisions that you make, because they really do make a difference. So I thank you so much for listening. And if you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Janet, thank you so very much for taking the time to share your story with us. And I want to ask all of our students now who are in classrooms to take a couple moments to reflect on any questions that you might like to ask to Janet. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask, you can share that with your teacher, and your teacher will enter that into the chat. Janet, I have some colleagues who already sent me questions that their students had developed in advance, and I'd like to maybe start with one or two of those. And I have a question that I'd like to start with as well. I know that many survivors of the Holocaust for a long time chose not to tell their stories. And I wonder if there was a time where you chose not to tell your story, and if that's the case, when did you start telling your story, and why did you start? And if you have always been telling your story, maybe you could talk to us a little bit more about why, unlike many others, you've chosen to tell your story all along.
So survivors did not tell their story till, I would say, early 80s. That's a long time, from mid 40s. The events of the war were so, the crimes were unspeakable. It was something that was so difficult to talk about. And frankly, people here had a hard time hearing these atrocities. So it took a long time for people to get some distance and start speaking. I think it was after there was a series on TV in the early 70s about the Holocaust, and I think that sort of opened up the conversation. So I didn't speak about my experiences till, I would say, late 70s or early 80s maybe. I decided at first, I kind of minimized my story. I felt like, well, I never went to concentration camps, so I didn't suffer. I measured the suffering. I didn't suffer as much as those people did. But then when I heard other people say similar things, and I realized that that I had an important story to tell, and so I just started very slowly to speak, and also it had to do a lot with facing history. I joined facing history, and it was through them that I started to speak at first, with their support and their resources, and I felt I felt supported, so I was able to speak.
Thank you, Janet. Janet, let me ask a couple of questions that have come in from our students. One question is, a student was wondering if you could talk some more about how you got in contact with your father after the war, and how, I know that you mentioned that, Lena had run into him, and
right. So my father, So my father looked for me for a long time, and he wrote a diary after the war, not during the war, but so he wrote down things that had happened to him, and in that he said, "How do you find a child in the city of 350,000 people? How do you find a child?" So he was searching for me, and it just so happened that he went to the refugee center, and Lena was there, and that's how he found me.
Mm-hmm. Janet, one of our students asked if you had ever considered changing your name back to your birth name, and how you felt about having to change your identity so many times over the course of your childhood and your life.
Right. Well, as a child, I just did whatever I was told, and I accepted. I didn't have an opportunity to develop my own individuality. So I just did, I knew what I had to do, whatever I was told to do. I, over the years, I considered changing my name, and I must add that times were very different, in the late 40s or 50s. People did not, were not able to be themselves. Like um, people wanted to conform and to be like other people. And if you had a strange name, that wasn't cool. Or, today, we have people in this country from every ethnic background with every kind of a name, with different hairstyles. But in those days, people conformed much more. So that was, that was the other thing. But I considered changing my name many times, but I never did. So it's too late.
Janet, one of our students was asking, how many languages do you speak, or did you speak at one point in your life?
Oh, well, I did speak Polish, but my Polish is a little rusty. Although when I went back to Poland, I've been back 4 times, and it does come back to me, and I'm able to speak and understand. But I have nobody to speak with now, so I don't speak it now, and I don't speak any other languages. Sadly, I studied French, but I'm not fluent.
When you grew up as a child before the war, did you speak Yiddish in your household, or did you speak Polish?
No, we spoke Polish.
Mhm.
I mean, some members of the family spoke Yiddish, but so I never learned Yiddish, so I don't know it.
One of our students asked if you could talk about what was it like the first time you went back to Poland?
It was very strange. It was very strange and uncomfortable. Like I just wanted to go to the places that I remembered. I didn't consider this like a vacation where I would, go to the museums and enjoy myself. So I went with my family, and what was remarkable was that I didn't at first, before the trip, I didn't know where we were going because I didn't remember the address. And just luckily, going through some cartons in the basement, I came across a yellow sheet of paper, stuff I had written. I remember my father making me, insisting that I write everything down. So that's where I found the address of the family. And so my family waited downstairs, and I went up the stairs, knocked on the door, and the parents had died already. So these were the children, the grown children, and they were still there. And I was, welcomed with open arms, and it was very surreal. Then they pulled out pictures of me when I was there. My kids couldn't believe to see these pictures, and it was amazing.
Jenny, I was actually very interested in the story of the photographs that you have in the slideshow. How did you have all these photographs?
So in those days, people took a lot of photographs. I mean, that's how they communicated. They were always sending pictures to each other. They were not, my uncle was in Palestine, and one uncle studied in Belgium. One uncle was in Italy, and some of the photos were taken. My grandfather, who was in Siberia, he grabbed the photos before they left. So that's, just gathering them up like that. I have.
So those pictures went from Poland to Siberia, and your grandfather managed to bring
Oh
them
yeah,
back to
yeah. They've
Poland.
been all over Israel. Yeah, all over.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
Janet, what about?
I was just going to add that in 2012, I was contacted by a young woman. Her name was Carolina Pans. She was working on her PhD from the University of Warsaw. She was doing her thesis on the Holocaust. And she found me on the internet. And so we became very, very friendly, very close. And she's the one who did all this research on my family. That's why I know as much as I do about what happened to my family members. I know what happened to my grandfather, one of the uncles that was shot. He was hiding in the attic, and a 14-year-old boy denounced him, which is really curious, but I guess not so curious, that this was a Jewish boy who was he was like an errand boy for the Nazis. And, that maybe they gave him more food, or they, you know, saved his life. And so he denounced my uncle, and they arrested him and shot him. My grandfather was arrested on the street in Krakow. Someone recognized him, reported him to the Gestapo, and he was arrested. Then they attached him to a horse-drawn cart and dragged him, and that's how he died. And so I know all these different ways that my family was killed. And my mother, because initially, years ago, I used to tell the story that my mother, I thought, died in Auschwitz, because in one of the display, closet, whatever you call them, there were a bunch of suitcases with the name Singer on top. So I thought, well, maybe that was my mother. But over the years, the story changed of what happened to my mother. But the story that you heard today is an accurate story of what happened to her.
Janet, I'd like to maybe do one or two more questions before we finish. Are you in contact with other survivors, and can you talk about what those relationships are like?
Yes, of course, I'm in contact through Facing History, and I'm close to some of them and friendly with them. Every survivor stories is different. I know survivors who cannot tell their story, have never been able to. And sadly, I'm one of the younger survivors, and I'm going to be 86 next month. So there aren't that many left anymore.
Mm-hmm. Janet, did your father speak about his stories to anyone besides you?
No, he never spoke. Mm-hmm. No. And he and I didn't speak that much, because I was always fearful of making him sad or causing any more pain that he already went through. So I avoided the subject. And I'm sorry for that, because I would have asked a lot more questions.
Yeah. Janet, even before you started telling your story publicly to groups of students or other groups, when did you start telling people you met? Like, when did you start telling friends your story?
Oh gosh, it's not like I ever told my story in depth. Like, it was just like, yeah, I was a hidden child, and I survived in Poland, and that, the very basic facts, but nothing in detail. I didn't talk about it much until I started to speak.
Janet, I want to just take a moment on behalf of our school community to just offer our sincere thanks for taking the time to share your story with us today. It's so powerful and so important, and I'm so thankful that our students could have this opportunity. We are very, very hopeful that next year we can welcome you back to Milford in person.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And Janet, I'm going to, at this stage, I'm going to leave my colleagues to spend the last part of our day with our students, giving them a chance to reflect on what they've heard and learned, and to have some time to discuss. But we wish you the very, very best. Stay well. And we so very much hope that we can see you in person next year.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, Janet. Take care.
Thank you.
And for all of my colleagues at this stage, we're going to end our program, and I'll ask that you spend the remainder of the day giving our students a chance to reflect and talk about this. And I want to thank all of you who are remote students who've managed to log in and participate with us this afternoon as well. Okay. Thank you, everyone.